En este momento la sala ya está abierta y se inicia la transmisión en YouTube.
Doctor Sergio Andrés Pulgarín, vicerrector de la Universidad del Rosario. Doctor Ignacio Corazzoli, representante del Grupo del Banco Interamericano de Desarrollo en Colombia. Señoras y señores, muy buenos días para todos. Y bienvenidos a la cuarta conferencia de la Red de Economía de la Innovación y el Emprendimiento de América Latina y el Caribe, RIE, organizada por la Facultad de Economía de la Universidad del Rosario, la Alianza EFI, Economía Formal e Inclusiva, el Banco Interamericano de Desarrollo, el Young Scholars Initiative y Colombia Científica. Saludamos a quienes nos acompañan de manera virtual y a toda la audiencia que nos sigue vía streaming a través del canal de YouTube institucional de la Universidad del Rosario. Los invitamos a interactuar a lo largo de estos 3 días en Twitter con el hashtag #RIE Conference 2020. Recuerden que las conferencias principales que se realicen en la sala general tendrán traducción simultánea. Para acceder, solo deben hacer clic en el icono que encuentran en la parte inferior de la barra de herramientas. Iniciamos la cuarta versión de la Conferencia RIE 2020 con el saludo de bienvenida del doctor Sergio Andrés Pulgarín, vicerrector de la Universidad del Rosario. El doctor Pulgarín es PhD en Ciencias de la Dirección y Magíster en Dirección y Gerencia de Empresa de la Universidad del Rosario, MBA de la Escuela de Negocios de Navarra y administrador de empresas en su pregrado. Cuenta con más de 15 años de experiencia como profesor investigador en áreas de estrategia, tecnología e innovación y emprendimiento, donde ha recibido varios reconocimientos a la docencia de excelencia. En la actualidad es profesor asociado de carrera de la Escuela de Administración de la Universidad del Rosario e International Visiting Professor del CEP Program de la Universidad de Leipzig, Alemania. Es miembro del Grupo de Investigación de Dirección y Gerencia de la Escuela de Administración y creador del Centro de Innovación Innova. Su investigación converge en el estudio de la innovación como proceso evolutivo y emergente y la caracterización de los perfiles de competencias en el emprendedor. Buenos días y adelante, doctor Sergio.
Bueno, muchas gracias, Laura. Muy buenos días para todos y todas el día de hoy. Un saludo especial, por supuesto, a nuestros conferencistas, principalmente al doctor Ignacio Corazzoli, representante del grupo VIDE en Colombia y que nos acompaña en esta sesión inaugural. Por supuesto, al doctor Juan Miguel Gallego, director de investigaciones de la Universidad del Rosario y quien al mismo tiempo cumple el rol de director científico del programa Colombia Científica de la Universidad del Rosario, que además tiene por ocasión la convergencia de buena parte del ecosistema científico del país en un tema tan importante en este momento como es, por supuesto, el tema de empleabilidad y la formalidad de la informabilidad e inclusión en términos del desarrollo económico del país. Por supuesto, a la doctora Baldwin Hall, profesora emérita de Economía de la Universidad de California en Berkeley, al doctor Gustavo Crespi, especialista en competitividad, tecnología e innovación del Banco Interamericano de Desarrollo, al doctor Pierre Mogen, con quien tuve la oportunidad de dialogar hace unos minutos y aliado estratégico de nuestra universidad y profesor de econometría de la Universidad de Maastricht, que también es un aliado importante para nuestra Universidad del Rosario y para el ecosistema de investigación en el país. Por supuesto, extiendo también un saludo a los investigadores de América Latina que participan de manera activa, no solo en este evento, sino en toda la red de socios que convocan los estudios de innovación vinculados a nuestra universidad y a la alianza. Y por supuesto a los estudiantes, tanto de nuestra universidad como de las universidades aliadas que participan en este evento el día de hoy. Yo quisiera arrancar esta introducción refiriéndome a dos temas centrales, unas reflexiones generales alrededor de la innovación y del significado de la innovación, y unas reflexiones adicionales relacionadas con la manera como en la Universidad del Rosario abordamos, por supuesto, la innovación. En esa línea, compartirles que desde el punto de vista general, quizás la reflexión arranca alrededor de la discusión permanente de qué entendemos por innovación. Los que gravitamos en el ámbito del management y de las disciplinas aplicadas al management, pues por supuesto entendemos la importancia de propiciar unas condiciones mucho más claras que habiliten, por supuesto, lo que hemos denominado como el estatuto epistemológico de la administración y de manera particular el estatuto epistemológico de la innovación. Y ahí entonces es donde inicia la discusión principal. Quizás uno de los problemas centrales que hay alrededor del estudio de la innovación es lo que yo denomino como el evangelio de la innovación. Las organizaciones se han subido en este bus, se ha vuelto una bandera de inversión en distintos ámbitos. Todos hablamos de innovación, todos discutimos alrededor de la innovación, pero al final es difícil concretar de manera técnica qué significa esto. Quizás de todas las diferentes definiciones sobre las cuales yo he podido explorar este concepto, me quedo con una que para mí explica la esencia principal del fenómeno y que por sus características tiene varias connotaciones interesantes porque la persona que la construye de hecho ni siquiera tiene que ver o tiene una relación directa con el campo. Yo me quedo con la frase de Jorge Wagensberg, donde él define que la innovación es básicamente cualquier cosa que deja de ser cualquier cosa. Y eso para mí tiene un significado exponencial en lo que podemos entender en la Universidad del Rosario de manera particular sobre innovación. Yo creo que uno podría apropiar el fenómeno de la innovación desde dos de sus raíces. Una raíz que entiende la innovación como el innova, la agregación de lo nuevo, y eso entonces nos lleva a un dominio de la innovación, por supuesto, entendida desde el punto de vista del resultado. Pero creo que la que se transversaliza en el contexto de Wagensberg, que de hecho explica no solo mi aproximación a este concepto, sino también la manera como en la Universidad del Rosario la interpretamos, es más desde la raíz del innovare, es decir, la innovación entendida como un proceso de transformación. Y cuando uno aborda la innovación como un proceso de transformación, pues por supuesto entiende varias cosas. Lo primero es que es un fenómeno multiescalado. La innovación no es un proceso que emerge en una escala, sino que emerge en la interacción de múltiples escalas. Y de manera particular, cuando yo lo llevo a un contexto, digamos, macro, un contexto de país, pues lo que podemos definir entonces es que innovación es el resultado de la interacción entre las capas más macro, entre el desarrollo de lo que nosotros denominamos como entornos habilitantes para la innovación en términos de un contexto de diseño de política pública y en una escala menor la intención y el desarrollo, por supuesto, de competencias y habilidades para innovar. Eso me lleva entonces a decirles que en una idea de innovación como proceso de transformación, buena parte de los elementos centrales de discusión en el marco, por supuesto, de economías latinoamericanas y en particular como la de Colombia, pues esto gravita alrededor al menos de 4 puntos. Un primer punto que hace referencia a la necesidad de hacer una transición de una economía basada en eficiencia a una economía basada en innovación, que por supuesto pues es uno de los ejes centrales del discurso sobre el cual el Foro Económico Mundial promueve el desarrollo de transiciones, de la transición de nuestra economía. Por supuesto, de manera muy puntual, en el caso de Colombia, el fortalecimiento de la institucionalidad para el desarrollo de startups y formalización de empleo y formalización de organizaciones que nos lleven a trascender a un ecosistema donde el desarrollo de empresas no sea no sea por necesidad, sino por oportunidad. De hecho, creo que buena parte de las condiciones están dadas. Colombia es uno de los pocos países de América Latina que se puede dar el lujo de tener un unicornio y estamos cerca de tener un segundo unicornio en la definición del lenguaje de startups que a esto se refiere. Por supuesto, la consolidación del ecosistema de emprendimiento e innovación del país, que es determinante para asegurar condiciones de desarrollo económico en el marco de la pandemia. Y un cuarto punto que nos convoca el día de hoy, y es por supuesto la educación para la transformación y la innovación. Esta precisamente es la apuesta de esta universidad. Y pasándome específicamente al tema de educación, contarles que en la Universidad del Rosario sí que tenemos apuestas importantes por la transformación y la innovación en educación. Primero, hemos trabajado fuertemente desde el 2014 para consolidar un modelo de innovación como universidad, que tiene ocasión y mayor interés en este momento, pues por supuesto en el marco de la pandemia. En el marco de la pandemia, la universidad ha trabajado muy fuertemente en el desarrollo de lo que denominamos el modelo High Flex, un modelo híbrido y flexible que le permita a la universidad adaptarse a unas condiciones de pandemia que implican presencialidad y acceso remoto al mismo tiempo. Para eso hemos hecho grandes desarrollos. Y al mismo tiempo esto se complementa, por supuesto, con las nuevas apuestas institucionales. La Universidad del Rosario ha emprendido dos grandes apuestas institucionales en términos de campos de conocimiento. Una primera que converge en la formalización de su Escuela de Ingeniería y Ciencia y Tecnología, que hoy en día es una realidad. Cuenta con una batería de programas altamente innovadores, basados en el desarrollo de cultura maker, en una cultura donde se pensaron unas ingenierías centradas en la humanidad, básicamente por el perfil humanista de la universidad, unas ingenierías basadas en la experimentación y, por supuesto, unas ingenierías donde la ciencia de datos es el eje central de desarrollo. De manera paralela, un segundo campo de conocimiento, que es nuestra Facultad de Creación, que tiene una característica no solo de recuperación de los saberes latinoamericanos y ancestrales y la apropiación de innovación en la idea propia de transformación para la dotación de factores de países en Latinoamérica, sino también el desarrollo de un componente transdisciplinar y multidisciplinar en la universidad que nos permita recombinar saberes y a partir de esa recombinación construir nuevas formas de solucionar problemas. Para terminar, en el ámbito de la innovación pedagógica, que creo que es determinante para una universidad, contarles que la universidad se ha movido en el desarrollo de tres proyectos realmente muy gruesos. Un proyecto que denominamos UR STEAM, donde la idea de este proyecto es consolidar una plataforma de desarrollo de soluciones y de consolidación de relación con el sector externo, que permita a través de la generación de metadisciplinas nuevas formas de solución de problemas a partir no solo del uso de laboratorios aplicados, sobre los cuales hemos generado una inversión de más de 40.000 millones de pesos, sino además de eso un aprendizaje basado en la experimentación. En esa línea también contarles que tenemos otro gran proyecto que se llama UR Labs, donde el espíritu es hacer una transformación pedagógica de los procesos de enseñanza-aprendizaje de la universidad, donde la experiencia y la experimentación tienen una vocación principal en el proceso de aprendizaje. Se trata de prodigar las metodologías activas de la universidad para llevar al estudiante del mañana a reconfigurar y a redimensionar el valor de la presencialidad en el campus, en principalmente la práctica y la experimentación. Y por supuesto un modelo que nosotros denominamos como modelo de educación digital, donde a partir de tres pilares, el pilar de la convergencia digital, el pilar de la experiencia digital, el pilar de la diversificación digital, la Universidad del Rosario ha ido liderando desde el 2014, como lo menciono, buena parte de los procesos de apropiación y transformación de esta y de varias de las universidades del país hacia una estructura soportada no solo en el uso de tecnologías, sino también en el uso de la digitalidad para poder afianzar los procesos de enseñanza-aprendizaje. Por supuesto, existen una gran cantidad de desarrollos en términos de innovación social vinculados a transformación de comunidades y al fomento al desarrollo del emprendimiento y el intraemprendimiento, y un trabajo enorme en términos de innovación vinculada a nuestro aparato o a nuestro ecosistema de investigación en clave de transferencia, lo cual mucho más adelante dialogaremos en detalle y que por supuesto no quiero profundizar en esto. Un poco con estas reflexiones iniciales, pues cierro mi presentación, de nuevo agradeciéndoles a todos ustedes la oportunidad, mencionarles que Por supuesto, este es un tema apasionante tanto para mí como para nuestra universidad. Agradecerle la participación a nuestros invitados y a cada uno de los participantes de este evento y decirles que las puertas, por supuesto, de la Universidad del Rosario presencial y virtuales están abiertas para todos ustedes. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, doctor Sergio, por su intervención. A continuación, escucharemos las palabras del doctor Ignacio Corazzoli, quien actualmente es el representante del Grupo del Banco Interamericano de Desarrollo en Colombia, ciudadano italiano y uruguayo. Fue nombrado en el 2016 representante del BID para Europa e Israel y también se desempeñó como asesor del presidente del Banco Interamericano de Desarrollo. Es licenciado en Derecho de la Universidad Católica de Lovaina y Ciencias Políticas por el London School of Economics. Además, tiene una maestría en Políticas Públicas de esta última universidad. Adelante, doctor Ignacio.
Muchas gracias a todos, especialmente le quiero agradecer al vicerrector de la Universidad de Rosario, a Sergio Pulgarín, así como a todos los miembros, los organizadores del evento, al Young Scholar Initiative, del Institute of New Economic Thinking, a la Alianza Economía Formal e Inclusiva, el programa Colombia Científica, así como a todos mis colegas que han venido contribuyendo para hacer este evento el día de hoy. Le estaba pensando un poco, retomando las palabras que decía el vicerrector, pensando en todo lo que el banco, y no sé qué tan familiarizados estarán ustedes con el grupo banco, y algunos se podrán preguntar, bueno, ¿pero qué hace un banco financiando innovación y emprendimiento? Innovación y emprendimiento es precisamente uno de los sectores que nuestro nuevo presidente del banco viene impulsando. Nosotros, un poco para retomar lo que decía el vicerrector, no podemos seguir respondiendo a la pandemia y a los problemas que tienen cada una de nuestras sociedades con las mismas soluciones que antes. Desde el banco tenemos que pensar y repensar nuestra forma de actuar con las sociedades, con cada uno de ellos. La pandemia, obviamente, la ha puesto, y bien lo decía el vicerrector previamente, ha puesto un poco en tela de duda nuestras capacidades científicas y tecnológicas y la importancia de las mismas para poder tomar las mejores decisiones de políticas públicas, ¿no? Eso quedó muy revelado, quizás el ejemplo más ilustrativo fue el tema de la salud pública en la región. Todos vimos, por ejemplo, la importancia de pronto de tener los ventiladores que fuesen hechos en nuestros países y la dependencia que tenemos hacia otros mercados. Todos vimos la importancia de que nuestras empresas en algunos productos básicos estuviesen integrados a la cadena de valor. Yo arranqué la pandemia estando en Madrid y era flagrante, por ejemplo, darse cuenta que no hay ningún ibuprofeno que se hace en Europa hoy en día, sino que la mayoría de ellos son importados de otros mercados, ¿no? Entonces, eso demuestra un poco la vulnerabilidad de nuestras sociedades y a su vez demuestra que el desarrollar y potenciar innovación y emprendimiento es la solución precisamente para enfrentar estos problemas. A su vez, la pandemia en su segunda faceta lo que hizo es, y disculpen la palabra que voy a usar, es desnudar las sociedades y mostró, exacerbó, diría yo, las desigualdades que ya tiene la región, que ya tienen cada uno de nuestros países. Nosotros veníamos desde el banco hace muchos años, yo había sido uno de los autores de un libro del presidente Moreno en su momento, que se llamaba La década de América Latina, cuando estábamos en el pleno boom de los commodities, cuando estábamos en un estado de euforia. La gente se recuerda más bien de la fiesta y no se recuerda de la segunda parte, que era una oportunidad si hacíamos las reformas. Y fueron pocos los países nuestros que realmente hicieron las reformas que tenían que hacer. Ahí quizás perdimos una oportunidad para dar un salto, precisamente para poder enfrentar algunas de las raíces de las desigualdades de algunos de nuestros países. Pero de vuelta, innovación, emprendimiento es parte de la solución que nosotros queremos impulsar. Queremos ver un poco cómo podemos trabajar con ustedes en ese sentido. Queremos traerle, y bien lo decía el vicerrector, más temas a una de la ecuación. Acá en Colombia tuvimos hace nada, hace 10 días, un huracán, la primera vez que pasó un huracán de grado 5 por las islas, por los archipiélagos en el Caribe. Eso creo que y ayer decían, para mi sorpresa, que hay 40% de probabilidades de que vuelva a pasar huracanes de ese grado en esa zona de Colombia. Hay una clara relación con el cambio climático y los impactos que eso tiene para nuestras sociedades, ¿no? A su vez, no podemos decir que, les decía de vuelta, tenemos que enfrentar, y ahí yo sé que me estoy enfrentando a un público más joven y por lo tanto que quisiera que interpele más y que sea más dinámico y más ambicioso en las exigencias que tienen de nosotros. Nosotros teníamos sociedades que ya venían, previo a la pandemia, con algunas dificultades a nivel de diálogo social entre los diferentes actores de la región, especialmente con algunos estudiantes, había mucho descontento. No podemos olvidar que la crisis en la región fue revelada desde Brasil a Chile, por tickets de metro, que habían cierto aumento de precio, el cual hubo una reacción brutal de la sociedad que reclama mejores servicios y que estos servicios a su vez sean entregados en menos tiempo. Tenemos esta clase media que hemos venido desarrollando en nuestra región, que ha sido único, pero sin embargo que con la crisis hemos visto que la clase media se viene reduciendo y muchos de ellos están cayendo en pobreza. No podemos marearnos y equivocarnos. La clase media que tenemos en América Latina no es una clase media europea o americana, es una clase media que, según definen algunos estándares, es muy, diría, básica, por decirlo así, ¿no? El rol del banco, por lo tanto, es venir apoyando y mejorar la calidad de vida, pero más que todo venir apoyando a los gobiernos en formular políticas públicas que desarrollen, que contribuyen justamente a enfrentar estos problemas. Yo creo que hoy le quiero agradecer a la Universidad de Rosario, a la Alianza EFI, al Young Scholars Initiative y a Colombia Científica por darnos este espacio a nosotros, por darnos espacio para poder escucharlos, para poder aprender, para poder después nosotros en nuestros proyectos, en nuestros programas, poder fomentar políticas públicas en las cuales son más participativas y podemos replicar y ver cómo poder mejor dirigirnos a cada uno de nuestros países de las necesidades. Nada más desearle mucha suerte y mucho éxito en este taller del día de hoy, agradecerles nuevamente a cada uno de ustedes y les pido que por favor seamos ambiciosos en lo que se proponen. Yo sé que tienen algunos de mis colegas del banco, desafíenlos, exígenles, porque eso es parte de nuestro trabajo para estar a la altura y darle respuesta a los desafíos que requieren nuestras sociedades. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, doctor Corazzoli, por su intervención. Iniciamos entonces con la agenda del día 1 de la cuarta Conferencia RIE 2020, con la presentación de resultados del Estudio Nacional de Emprendimiento a Tenderos realizado por la Alianza EFI. Damos la bienvenida al doctor Juan Miguel Gallego, director de Investigación e Innovación de la Universidad del Rosario y director científico de la Alianza EFI. Además, es miembro del comité organizador y del comité científico de esta conferencia. Adelante, doctor Juan Miguel.
Hola, buenos días a todos. Quiero agradecer el apoyo del Banco Interamericano de Desarrollo, al doctor Ignacio Corlazzoli por sus palabras, a la Universidad del Rosario, al doctor vicerrector Sergio Pulgarín, a nuestros colegas del banco que nos han apoyado en todo el proceso, con los cuales hemos construido esta red en los últimos 4 años, al Young Scholar Initiative por apoyarnos en esta versión y habernos compartido sus ideas de cómo podríamos alcanzar más estas ideas de innovación, no solo desde la investigación y los hacedores de política, sino también a los estudiantes. A Colombia Científica, que es una de las apuestas más importantes que ha tenido Colombia en términos de construcción de ciencia, tecnología e innovación para la sociedad, tratando de enlazar no solo la parte científica y académica, sino también el Estado, las empresas y el sector productivo. Hoy queremos presentar rápidamente uno de nuestros programas de investigación en Alianza EFI alrededor de los procesos de inclusión productiva y social, en particular formalización. Nosotros tenemos 7 proyectos en la Alianza EFI que giran alrededor de todo el problema de inclusión productiva, viendo el problema de formalización como un problema continuo que aborda diferentes espacios del quehacer económico de las poblaciones latinoamericanas, aplicada principalmente a Colombia. El proyecto que presentamos hoy es el proyecto de emprendimiento e informalidad empresarial. ¿Qué es lo que hicimos en Alianza EFI? Uno de nuestros objetivos era alcanzar poblaciones particulares donde la inclusión productiva era necesaria e hicimos un estudio nacional de tenderos y de recicladores en más de 10 ciudades colombianas, tratando primero de diagnosticar las características y las ausencias de ciertos, digamos, iniciativas como capacidades empresariales, uso de Internet, inclusión financiera dentro de estas poblaciones, de manera tal que nos permitieran entender barreras hacia la inclusión productiva, pero también cómo podríamos actuar. Entonces, en nuestro programa hoy queremos presentarles un video que resume los alcances de diagnóstico y los pasos a seguir. ¿Qué siguen estos 3 años y medio que tenemos de programa? En particular, en este proyecto necesitamos construir iniciativas de política pública que permitan a estas poblaciones generar un proceso virtuoso de inclusión productiva, de innovación y de asumir, digamos, procesos importantes. Lo interesante de este proyecto fue una medición que se hizo al final del 2019. Vamos a tener unas intervenciones a lo largo del 2021 y vamos a tener medidas en el final del 2021 y 2022. Muy interesante es que el panorama que vamos a observar es un panorama antes de la pandemia, antes de la COVID-2019, y quizás lo que vamos a entrar a medir y a intervenir va a ser un poco diferente, y eso nos va a permitir ajustar nuestras políticas en este sentido. Entonces, dando paso al video, los invito a que los organizadores proyectemos el video, y muchas gracias por este espacio.
En los barrios de Colombia existe un esquema comercial que no pasa de moda, que hace parte del comercio minorista, pero a su vez son un canal importante para las empresas de consumo masivo, un lugar de interacción y donde se pueden adquirir productos. Se trata de las tiendas de barrio o microestablecimientos, manejadas directamente por su propietario, el tendero, en la mayoría de las veces. Pero, ¿qué sucede en estos microestablecimientos? ¿Cuáles son los aspectos demográficos y económicos detrás del mostrador? Los profesores Paul Rodríguez, de la Facultad de Economía de la Universidad del Rosario, y Andrés Felipe Ortiz, de la Corporación Universitaria Minuto de Dios, Uniminuto y líder del proyecto, encontraron algunas respuestas gracias al primer informe del Estudio Nacional de Emprendimiento a Tenderos, ENET, una encuesta realizada a 1.654 establecimientos en 10 municipios del país: Bello, Barranquilla, Bogotá, Girardot, Soacha, Zipaquirá, Neiva, Pereira, Bucaramanga e Ibagué.
El Estudio Nacional a Tenderos, ENES, es una caracterización próxima a los tenderos del área de influencia de las sedes de Uniminuto. Es una gran encuesta nacional que hicimos alrededor de 7 ciudades, y en ella lo que buscábamos era caracterizar y conocer las necesidades más importantes y apremiantes de los tenderos y de los microestablecimientos de Colombia en estas ciudades.
Es decir, queremos entender cómo las tiendas de barrio, principalmente, funcionan, qué pasa con los dueños de estas tiendas de barrios, cuántos empleados tienen, cuáles fueron sus motivaciones. La otra gran parte de este objetivo es ser la primera piedra para un estudio en el cual estamos realizando una capacitación mediante una aplicación que se llama Expertienda, para fomentar algunas habilidades gerenciales y otras prácticas reconocidas en la literatura académica como determinantes del éxito en los negocios.
Una gran encuesta que hace parte del macroproyecto llamado Inclusión Productiva y Social, Programas y Políticas para la Promoción de una Economía Formal, Alianza EFI, financiado por el programa gubernamental Colombia Científica y liderado por la Universidad del Rosario, con la participación de otras instituciones, entre ellas la Corporación Universitaria Minuto de Dios, UNAULA de Medellín, Fundación Avina y Fundación Capital. De las 1.654 encuestas realizadas, el 50,60% son mujeres, hombres el 48,90%. De estos microestablecimientos son dueñas el 60,74% frente al 54,38%. Y es que colocar una tienda tiene varias implicaciones. No son desempleados quienes se animan a tener su propio negocio. El 24,07% quiere mayores ingresos. El 16,74% ser su propio jefe. El 13,32% decide tener su propia empresa. el 13,5% es tradición familiar y solo el 6,48% no encontró trabajo.
Entonces lo que vemos es que principalmente en los datos, la motivación que tiene la gente para ser emprendedor es tener un negocio que ven más lucrativo que trabajar, es decir, son emprendedores. La segunda, digamos, está por el lado de la flexibilidad de tiempo, digamos, y el control un poco más directo de sus finanzas y su vida en general, digamos, esa capacidad de control. Y con eso pues ya tendríamos en gran medida lo que está determinando.
Y en ese tema es importante subrayar todo un emprendimiento intergeneracional, lo que significa que hay personas que emprenden porque ya su familia había sido emprendedora, porque además de tener una necesidad de desarrollarse económicamente, le generaba también una necesidad puntual de desarrollar esas capacidades asociadas al emprendimiento y a las iniciativas empresariales que ellos ya tienen como posibilidades de desarrollo.
Otro aspecto importante para hacer crecer el negocio es la capacitación.
La formación es fundamental para el desarrollo de cualquier negocio y mucho más, pues al darnos cuenta que la realidad es que muy pocos tenderos están capacitados en los temas claves para el desarrollo de sus unidades productivas.
En materia de formalidad, en medio de la informalidad de estos microestablecimientos o tiendas de barrio, según el líder del proyecto, tiene varios grados, en donde los dueños de los negocios superan etapas, es decir, controles sanitarios o mercantiles.
En esta lógica, pues uno se encuentra ciudades en las que hay mayores grados de formalidad, refiriéndome por estos al registro en Cámara de Comercio, a la existencia y representación legal del establecimiento, al registro ante la DIAN, y en otros la completa inexistencia de estos, además de simplemente pues tener un local y tener un contrato, a veces que ni siquiera puede existir. Entonces son diferentes grados en los que los diferentes negocios van teniendo formalidad o simplemente algunos de ellos van avanzando en función de las necesidades.
Y si la pandemia ha obligado a mirar hacia la virtualidad, el Internet y las transacciones digitales en las tiendas de barrio mantienen su estilo conservador. El 98% sigue usando efectivo y los pagos por Internet solo son un 3,2%. Contrario a lo que se auguraba, la adopción de nuevas tecnologías no es lo importante para los tenderos.
Entonces podemos esperar que se vayan adaptando a las necesidades un poco, que el uso de Internet se vuelva un poco más frecuente, similares en alguno de ellos, pero lo que creemos y consideramos es que este estilo de negocio va a perdurar durante un buen rato en la sociedad latinoamericana.
Muy bien, mil gracias al doctor Juan Miguel. Vamos a iniciar en este momento con las sesiones contributivas. El link de conexión lo encontrarán relacionado en la agenda del evento. Solo deben hacer clic en la sesión de su interés o también lo pueden encontrar en este momento en el chat de esta sala. Igualmente voy a proyectar para que puedan verlo fácilmente. Pero no puedo hacerlo en este momento. Bueno, simplemente ingresan a la agenda del evento. Creo que ahora sí puedo. Permítanme, les voy a compartir. Ingresan a la agenda del evento, dan clic y enseguida les aparecerá la agenda oficial. En este momento ingresan a las sesiones contributivas y aquí eligen la sesión de su interés. Aquí encuentran el link de conexión. Muy bien, recuerden que a las 12:15 iniciaremos en esta misma sala la conferencia de la profesora emérita Browning Hall. Para volver aquí, la sala principal, solo deben buscar el botón de conexión en la agenda e ingresar nuevamente. Recuerden usar siempre nuestro hashtag para interactuar en Twitter, numeral RIE Conference 2020. Nuevamente los invitamos a pasar a las sesiones contributivas. El link lo encontrarán en la agenda oficial del evento. Pueden ingresar y elegir la sesión de su interés. Les recordamos que a las 12:15 iniciaremos en esta misma sala la conferencia de la profesora emérita Browning Hall. Para volver a esta sala únicamente deben buscar el botón de conexión en la agenda oficial. Muy bien, continuamos con nuestra agenda. Recuerden, por favor, que esta conferencia tiene traducción simultánea. Para acceder a ella únicamente deben dirigirse a la parte inferior de la barra de herramientas y activar en el icono del mundo. Allí podrán deshabilitar el audio original y elegir el audio que prefieren. Quiero invitar en este momento al doctor Fernando Vargas, especialista en competitividad, tecnología e innovación en el Banco Interamericano de Desarrollo, quien presentará a nuestra conferencista de hoy, la profesora emérita de Economía de la Universidad de California en Berkeley, Browning Hall. Adelante, doctor Fernando.
Muchísimas gracias, Laura. Es para mí un placer primero recibirlos en esta Bogotá virtual que estamos armando, en esta versión de reemplazo de lo que habíamos pensado originalmente tener en vivo en Bogotá, junto a la Universidad del Rosario, la Alianza EFI, la Young Scholar Initiative del Institute of New Economic Thinking y como parte también de las actividades de Colombia Científica. En este segmento, en esta sesión plenaria, es para mí un placer tener la oportunidad de presentar a la doctora profesora Browning Hall, que es profesora emérita de la Universidad de California en Berkeley. También es profesor visitante en el Instituto Max Planck en Múnich, además de también ser investigadora asociada de múltiples organizaciones como el National Bureau of Economic Research, el Instituto de Estudios Fiscales de Londres y el Instituto de Economía e Investigación Social en Londres. La profesora Holt ha sido también profesora por muchos años de la Universidad de Maastricht, asociada con UNU Merit. Tiene un background originalmente desde el área de la física en Wesley College y un PhD en economía de la Universidad de Stanford. La profesora Holt tiene múltiples publicaciones en los mejores journals en la materia, en los ámbitos tanto de innovación, investigación y desarrollo, emprendimiento, patentes y la generación de conocimiento en general. En esta oportunidad tenemos la siguiente charla que nos va a presentar sobre llamada ¿Is there a role for patents in the financing of new innovative firms? Un tema que por supuesto es muy relevante considerando el renovado interés que tiene el fomento a la creación de nuevas empresas basadas en tecnología en América Latina y el Caribe, y en Colombia en particular, que hoy ha aprobado su política nacional de emprendimiento. En ese contexto, nuevamente reitero mi felicidad de presentar a la profesora doctora Browning Hall. Browning, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much for the introduction, and I'm, very sorry not to be there in Bogota, but I suppose many of you are not in Bogota either at this point. So the paper, the presentation is based on the paper, which is actually published very recently in Industrial and Corporate Change. I think it's under a slightly different title. I'm not sure about that. So in case of looking for references or anything like that, you should go to that special issue, or you could go to my website because the paper is posted on my website. So you can download it for free if you don't have access at ICC. Now I finally got to all of the people. Okay. So I'm going to share my screen. At least I'm going to try to share my screen. See, where is it? There it is. Okay. And I'm going to put it full screen. There. Okay. So now we can, I have multiple things on here, but I think this will work. So sadly, I have not been able to visit my colleagues at Munich or London or indeed Paris, the Collège de France, where I'm also a visitor. So I'm here in Berkeley. The starting point for this paper is a graph I made, a chart I made quite a while ago. Okay, I'm making this smaller. Oops, that was a mistake. quite a while ago, which essentially gives you the pros and cons of the patent system with respect to innovation and competition. So the idea here is that there are both positive and negative effects on innovation and competition. Along the diagonal, we have the traditional view, which is that the patent system creates an incentive for R&D and innovation investments. So it's good for innovation, but it creates short-term monopolies or market power, which in the presence of network effects, it can become longer term because it gives the holder of the patent a benefit in first mover benefit in a network setting. The off diagonals here are what we've learned in the last 20, 30 years or even longer about contrary effects. On innovation, there's a notion that the patent system can actually impede the combination of new ideas and inventions because it raises the cost of combining them, raises the transactions costs. And this inhibits cumulative invention. In other words, it makes it more expensive for people to build on the work of others. This is particularly the work of Scotchmer on cumulative invention and how to solve the problem of getting the optimal outcome. The positive effects on competition are that the patent system, because it creates an own property idea, can be of new small firms with limited assets, and enabling what I call, I and others, not original to me, I think it comes back to Nate Rosenberg, enables vertical disintegration, which essentially means a more efficient structure for the industrial structure, which is to say firms are able to specialize in either invention or in the production of invention, because those who specialize in invention are granted rights to the invention, property rights to the invention, and therefore are able to operate as standalone and don't need to be integrated into production. This is recent example of this is the semiconductor sector, which has viable firms that essentially are specialized in design rather than in production of chips, farm out the production to Taiwan Semiconductor and places like that. Okay, so that's the starting point. The presentation and the paper are about the lower left-hand corner of the chart, which is it's about patents as an aid to obtaining finance and promoting competition from new entrants. So it's focused very much on startups or new firms. Now there's two different reasons, which are obviously related, but there are two different reasons here. One is the patent as asset, which I already mentioned, which is to say there's a salvage value if the firm fails. You still have this, you still have a property right to ideas, and those property rights might be worth something, thereby raising the value you can realize if the firm fails. Oops, forgot to turn off my email. So momentary pause. Okay. There we go. And the second reason is signaling, which is to say that the ownership of a patent provides information to potential investors about the quality of the startup idea or innovation, potential innovation. So I discussed these more in detail, some detail. The salvage value idea basically says that the startup firms in technology areas, which in almost all firms that expect to grow these days are in some kind of technology area. These firms have relatively few tangible assets. Their primary assets are ideas and inventions. And in principle, patent rights increase the salvage value if the firm fails, therefore makes the firm potentially more valuable, makes the investment potentially more valuable, and makes a financier more willing to put up money, in particular a venture capitalist more willing to put up money. Now, salvage value is defined as what a company expects to receive in exchange for selling or parting out the asset at the end of its useful life. The idea here is that the useful life to the company of the patent asset ends when the firm fails. If another firm can make use of that patent, and is willing to pay for the patent for that reason, that's the salvage value. Okay. Now you'll see later that making use of the patent comes in two forms, and I mean, one possibility is that the potential buyer is interested in the technology underlying the patent and would like the patent protection. But another possibility is that the buyer is interested only in enforcing the patent rather than using the technology. I think that's part of what we're going to talk about in the end is the second rather than the first. But I'll say more about that later. The signaling story is a slightly different story. It comes from this model by Michael Spence, Nobel Prize winning model for employees. For the obtaining of higher degrees of education as a signal to an employer that you're of higher quality. The argument being that you will indeed be of higher quality if you can succeed in obtaining the higher degree, but that the higher degree is not necessarily adding to your employability. It's simply that it signals that you are of higher quality. It's an asymmetric information model, and in the context here, the idea is the venture capitalist can't see project quality. High quality types signal their quality with patents. It's effective because it's easier or cheaper to get a patent if you have a high quality idea. Okay, the idea here is the patent examination system is doing something to help your signal. So that's the idea, okay, which is to say you've obtained a patent because it tells a potential investor that your idea is a good one. There's this refinement that I talk about, Conti et al., Conti, Thursby, and Thursby, I think. It's a refinement in which the model is directly applied to this problem, and they assume the cost of patenting is inversely related to project quality, and patents can also increase returns. And in this asymmetric information case, there is a unique signaling equilibrium. So that's essentially repeating, what I said. And the entrepreneur has this incentive to file for more patents. There's matching in their version of the model. There's matching between high quality venture capitalists and high quality entrepreneurs. So it's a somewhat richer model than the one I briefly described following on Spence. And then they test this empirically, and I'll talk a little about that later. So the next, I'm going to shift. That was the theory, a small review of the theory. I'm going to shift to the empirical evidence, which papers essentially address three questions. Many of the papers address more than one question. Okay. The first question is, does patenting encourage funding by VCs, venture capitalists, Or, you know, does it increase the amount of money you can obtain? And then there's the reverse question, which is, does venture capital funding lead to more patenting? Which is to say, does the reception of finance actually make you more successful at achieving patenting because you're able to finance further research? And does patenting itself lead to better startup performance in the form of growth or valuation at multiple rounds of venture capital financing, or survival? Now, these are all naturally simultaneous. Okay, the first two are directly simultaneous. And the third, you have venture capital funding can often be correlated both with patenting and with the expectations of future performance, which is to say that, you know, there's an unobserved quality, and that quality is correlated with patenting, correlated with expectations of future performance, and correlated with funding. And so the papers to date, except with the exception of one causal paper that I'll talk about, and one attempt to solve endogeneity, are mostly descriptive. You know, as addressing these questions. They're interesting. The results are interesting, but they don't necessarily answer the question of, for example, whether salvage value or signaling are more important for the obtaining of patents for new entrants. The first thing, however, before I talk more about the empirics, I first want to remind you of something which one always has to remember, which is that the patent system is not the most important thing in the world, and many firms survive and don't pay attention to the system at all. Okay, so even in the samples that are studied by the papers I reviewed, most of which are fairly high technology, okay, fewer than half of the firms in the samples have applied for patents. Now, it's early stage, typically, so they may apply in the future, but and this is exemplified, for example, by Microsoft. Okay, I mean, you can just go back and look at look at some of the big startups in the past. Microsoft didn't pay attention to patents until well into Windows 95. They were quite successful before they had applied for any patents. Applying for patents in these samples and elsewhere, I mean, it's not just in the samples I'm going to describe, are somewhat more likely in biotech and life sciences than in hardware or software. And we more or less knew that, especially software. That is, many firms do without, or they apply much later in their growth, often unobserved by the research papers surveyed here. If they apply later, usually the time interval examined by the research papers isn't long enough to see the application. Now, Stu Graham and various co-authors at the Berkeley Center for Law and Technology, Ted Sickelman and Pam Samuelson and various others, did a major survey of firms in biotech, life sciences, medical instruments, software, et cetera. And one of the things they asked in this survey was why you didn't apply for a patent. Okay, if the firm had not applied for a patent. So it was a whole set of firms, 1,000 or something. And what they found was, the first thing that people would say was the cost. Okay. It's not just the cost of getting a patent, it's the cost of enforcing the patent. The patent's of no use unless you can enforce it. And so, you know, that's included in part of the cost. Software firms essentially said, well, trade secret was pretty good protection too, and they tended to use that. By trade secret use in software, what's really meant is we only release the machine code. we don't release the source code. And that essentially, and we treat the source code as though it's trade secret, as though it's a trade secret. That's probably less and less useful, but it certainly is historically the way software firms have gone. What they originally did, of course, was copyright, which is free, copyright and use trade secrecy. Biotechnology, it was a different story. It was a fear that they would disclose too much if they patented early in the process. Okay, because essentially in the life sciences and biotechnology, the disclosure in the patent is much more informative than it is in the case of software, where there's nothing to disclose in a sense. It's an idea. It's not. There's no real technology there. Anyone who has the idea of one-click shopping can write the write the software independently of to perform one-click shopping. It's really so it's the idea is essentially costless. In the case of biotechnology, there's a lot more information and a lot more R&D behind the invention, and therefore disclosing that the outcome of that R&D is actually costly to the firm. So moving on, I think the conclusion there is simply to remind ourselves that there are other ways to be a successful startup. As time has passed, however, intellectual property strategy has become much more important for firms, and it's not clear that the success of the past firms that don't make use of it is something that's going to be repeated in the future. That forms of property than patents that are important to firms, namely trademarking, and as a subset of trademarking, website names, which are clearly quite important today for as a form of intellectual property. I mean, the ownership of a website name. I was just told that my internet connection was unstable. Are you all able to hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay.
I mean, sometimes it gets a little slow, but not that much of the time. So we're getting 99.9%.
Slowing me down is a good thing. Okay, so let's talk about evidence. My former student Rosemary Zidonis and David Hsu looked at 370 VC-backed semiconductor firms, and definitely found an association of the patent applications with funding round valuations, which is how much money you could get from the VC. And it looked like it was partly about information, because the boost was greater in earlier financing rounds when less is known about the firm, and when they're coming from investors who may be less well informed. Okay. They also, once you've got the patent stock, it also improved your ability to obtain liquidity through an initial public offering. So Mann and Sager looked at VC-backed software firms. Only 25% acquire a patent. That's consistent with what I was saying earlier. But firms that do get a patent experience better performance in terms of financing, survival, and exit. And why they exited. By exit status, I mean the following. There are two broad reasons for exit, particularly for software, but also for other areas. And the two are very different, because one of them is failure and one of them is success. So just knowing exit is not really that informative. Failure is they go bankrupt, it doesn't work, etc. Firm disappears. And success is they get bought by a larger firm in the same or related industry, and because they have a good technology. This is a well-known strategy of Cisco for years, but it's become more and more prevalent. Think about, Facebook acquiring WhatsApp and Facebook acquiring Instagram and so forth and so on. So these firms disappear, but it's success in the sense that the whole firm is bought, and often there's, when it's purchased, there's even contracts with the key employees to get them to stay for a period. And the net result is it's not a failure. It's not a failure of the technology. It's a success of the technology. So you've got two forms of exit. The point here being that it's a better experience. Getting a patent pushes you more towards the successful reason for exit rather than the failed reason for exit. So using the same survey, okay, so going back to this Graham et al. Paper, Sickelman and Graham look at startup and early stage companies based on this survey that I mentioned. The response rate was about 10%, but that corresponds to 1,000 companies. So it's a reasonably large sample. There's a problem with male surveys of this kind, obviously. Even if you spend effort trying to find the firms, find the people within the firms who are capable of answering, particularly in the case of startups, they have more important things to do than answering surveys. And so it is difficult to get them to answer unless unless it's a compulsory survey, such as administered by the Census Bureau. These firms rated financing and monitoring exit and improving exit valuation as moderately to very important motives for obtaining patents. So, there's some evidence there. Both companies and the expert investors. Okay, so they surveyed expert investors in companies as well as companies. And both of them said that patents were more important for biotech and medical devices than for software and internet firms, which is, again, reasserts what I've said before. Nevertheless, in spite of that, about half of the experts, meaning expert investors, meaning mostly venture capitalists, found patents were relevant for software and internet. Okay. So it's definitely, glass half full, glass half empty situation. And finally, there's this paper by Coburn and McGarvey, which essentially shows that in thicker software markets, which is to say software markets with lots of entrants, and that lack of patents does delay venture capital funding and initial public offerings. And especially after the legal changes in the United States in 1995 and 1998 that made patents in this area easier to get. However, as many of you know, this has been reversed in the United States by Alice and other decisions. It's no longer that easy to obtain patents directly in the software area. So, what they have here is something of a natural experiment, but that experiment, we could, there's been subsequent work, not directly related to theirs, but subsequent work looking at the reverse natural experiment overall. There's also non-US evidence. There's actually quite a bit, but it's all in high-income countries. I'm afraid I don't have any evidence that applies to middle-income countries such as, Colombia. I have done a little work with patenting in Chile, but not with relationship to startups at all. And I don't know, given the low patenting rates of Chilean firms, and they're extremely low, most Chilean patents are actually held by MNEs, multinationals. Given that, I don't think we would, we could ask whether it would be useful, but in the Chilean case at least, and I don't know about Colombia, the focus of the startups of firms in Chile in general is on trademarking rather than on patents. So with respect to Germany and the UK, there's a paper by Heusler and I think Coburn and can't remember all, which essentially showing that the examination process, not just the applications, but the things that are learned during the examination process, whether what the forms the citations take, whether the examiner goes back to the firm, etc. This reveals information which is a signal to venture capital investors, which is to say that it affects learning what happens in the examination process is revealing information which affects whether the size of the funding or whether or not they're going to be funded by VCs. So this is essentially an argument that it's not just the application that's informative, it's it's whether the application is going to succeed, etc., which is informative. Helmers and Rogers look at all high and medium tech startups in the UK in 2000 and find a positive impact of patent applications on growth. They do control for exit, because that's an issue when you're measuring growth, is the ones that aren't going to succeed do exit and they're not in the sample. Munari and Toshi look at nanotechnology firms that were financed by venture capitalists and find the importance that what really matters is patents in the nanotechnology technology, which is to say, just holding patents is not important. What matters is holding patents that are in the core technology. This matters for the amount of financing they receive. Greenberg looks at the VC-backed Israeli firms, as do Conti et al. In the paper I mentioned earlier. The finding in the Greenberg paper, which is additional, which is essentially related to the finding in Heusler et al., which is that when you have a younger pre-revenue firm, which is arguably one about which you know less, where it's harder to judge the quality of the invention, obtaining a grant in addition to making an application is informative. Okay, it helps the valuation. If you're an established firm, the application is relevant for valuation, but if you obtain a grant, it doesn't add any information. It doesn't mean grants aren't helpful. It's just that you're better able to predict the probability of a grant with knowing of an application, so it doesn't add information. The expectation there will be a grant is already incorporated in the evaluation. Notice that software again is an outlier. The Conti et al. Paper is trying to sort out the endogeneity between venture capital funding and patent applications. I mean, which is to say VC funding helps making a patent applications help getting funding. What it finds is that patent applications are endogenous to venture capital funding, except at the first round, which is to say that in the interpretation, sorry, my phone is ringing and I can't stop it. The first round of financing is the patent applications obtained before the first round of funding predict venture capital funding, but venture capital funding doesn't predict those, okay, is what's being said here. Arguing that they are somewhat informative, not fully simultaneous. But this all depends on whether you like the quality of the instruments. So here's an interim conclusion. This is not the conclusion for the talk. Let me check the time, actually. I think we started a little late. Yeah, we're okay. But the interim conclusion is that patents help startups raise funds. Patents are associated with better performance in terms of valuation, survival, and growth. But we don't know what is the source of increased funding and better performance. Is it the patent right, which is to say the asset, or the associated inventions for which the patent is a signal? Okay. And on this, I can offer one piece of causal evidence which is targeted to this question, okay, directly. So it's a pool of first-time U.S. patenters, for-profit firms, okay, so restricted to for-profit firms. So it's something of a universe, but it's only patenting firms because of the data is collected from the U.S. Patent Office. What they do is they instrument the patent application first action success by examiner leniency, and I will explain that, okay. By first action success, what's meant is when you send the application in, the examiner comes back with the thing saying, I think I'm going to grant it, or I won't grant it because of this and this and this. Now, the argument here is that first action success is a pretty good proxy for subsequent grant, but it's not contaminated by the negotiation process between the examiner and the patent applicant, okay? Because there is a negotiation process which is related to the quality of the invention. And so they want to purge it of that, of that piece of endogeneity. So they're essentially getting the examiner first reaction to whether it's patentable. Things like, prior art, this thing in the literature. So what's the idea of the instrument? The idea of the instrument is that we want something. The examiner leniency is the past grant probability of that examiner, okay? Examiners vary in their grant probability, even if you correlate, you control for the technology class that they're in, their seniority, various things like that. They vary in their leniency. And the argument is that the probability that an application will be granted is associated with grant probability. Okay, so that's a statement that the instrument is correlated with the thing that you're trying to instrument. But it's not correlated with the unobserved quality of the idea. Okay, so we're concerned about the fact that venture capital funding and patent applications may simultaneously both be functions of unobserved quality of the underlying idea. And this instrumental variables approach is intended to use an instrument to purge the unobserved quality from the patent. So when it's instrumented, if the first action decision is positive, okay, so the part that's only associated with the grant probability, the examiner's grant probability, then you get a 50 to 80% higher growth in the firm 5 years later. You get more follow-on patenting and greater access to venture capital funding. The implication here is that the patent right itself is valuable in addition to the invention. Okay, that's what this paper says. And that's interesting because many of us would have suspected that this wasn't true. In some ways, it contradicts my prior. That I would always assume that the patent was valuable because the underlying invention was valuable, but this says that getting the patent right itself is valuable. So I offer that. Now, I'm going to turn to a different set of evidence. So that prior evidence was really about the connection between obtaining financing and patents. And now I'm going to ask whether patents really do create salvage value, and if so, how? Okay. Now, the theory is just repeating what we said before. The patented invention has potential value, even if the firm that made it failed. It's potentially useful to another firm. Now, it's possibly in conjunction with their own inventions. It's unlikely to be useful by itself, because if it was, then the firm that originally made it would not have failed. But it's possible that there's a piece of technology that combined with other things that is still valuable. Now, the practice here is that where do these things go? I mean, when and if they are sold, okay. They're often purchased by other established firms for defensive purposes. They can be purchased by a mass patent aggregator and used in litigation, i.e. enforcement, or as we said earlier, defensive purposes. Feldman did a survey of venture capitalists to see if this, this idea that it was salvage value, that there was salvage value created by the patent, to see what the venture capitalists thought. And 65% of them don't consider salvage value when funding firms. This is in 2014 and earlier, okay. 18% do. So, as usual, some people think about it. The remainder are neutral on this subject. Okay. Again, this is something that may be changing over time. We'll say a bit about the market later. Now, okay. So the background for this is, how good is the market for ideas? Or market for, in this case, market for patents, but market for inventions by themselves without their complementary assets. Making a good innovation, a successful innovation, requires a lot more than just having a patent on a good idea, as you all know. But this is the patent on this is the market for the ideas themselves. So Gantz and Stern talk about use again a general Nobel Prize winning research by Alvin Roth on auction markets or markets in general, and they apply this research to ask whether the preconditions for a successful market succeed or fail in the case of ideas, and they find that the picture is not very good, which is to say, the market for ideas or inventions is, first of all, not very thick. And that's thick, meaning not a lot of players for any given invention, because they need, most inventions to be useful need complementary assets, and many of those assets may be held by other firms, which is to say you have to put together a package to make an innovation out of it. And that leads to a lot of transaction costs. Only a few firms can afford that. If you think about who's going to buy WhatsApp, there are just not that many players who have the ability to exploit it. A few of the big players. So it's not a thick market, which means not very competitive on pricing. Ideas are non-rival in use, but they tend to be quite rival in value, which is to say, if 10 firms come out with the same idea and produce, they're going to not individually not be very profitable because of the fact that there are too many entrants. Given copying and reverse engineering, the market for ideas in general is just not very safe. Now, patents clearly help with the last two of these. So that, that modifies one's thinking here. But in the sense that the rival in value won't be a problem if you have a model, if you're thinking about a situation where it's where the idea is the invention, is the innovation, and it's which is to say the one patent, one innovation model. If you're thinking about that, then of course owning the patent means you won't have a rival in value. But that's an oversimplified view, and the rival in value case seems more likely. The same is true. The second one is it's not a terribly safe market, even in the presence of some patents, given the ability to imitate, possibly without directly infringing on the patent. Now, Agrawal et al. Have a survey of potential licensors. Okay, people who might think about licensing a technology from another firm, and that's a market deal. It's not a sale, but it's similar to a sale. And what they find is the survey essentially asks, why do deals fail? Okay, and what they find is that finding a partner is difficult due to the thin market, and the disagreement on the scope of what the intellectual property covers. In other words, what Besson and Murrer would call the ill-defined boundaries of the patent. What inventions are covered and what inventions are not covered by the patent. There are a lot of bargaining frictions between the licensor and the licensee. And there's a lack of market safety due to the inability to fully protect the intellectual property, which really has to do with this, cost of enforcement, the notion that you really didn't need this particular piece of intellectual property in order to continue production, etc. So what's the evidence on salvage value, as opposed to what firms think? So most of the evidence that we have does not focus on startups, and actually I think there's a kind of there's a more thorough investigation that's needed here. And it's a little difficult to do because when a startup fails, it tends to kind of disappear, and it's hard to find a firm statement of what happened to the intellectual property. Certainly not online. I mean, you really would have to go out and talk to people. I mean, I was acquainted with one which was, essentially failed with patent applications in process. This was back in 2000, the .com boom. And I don't, no one ever really knew what happened to them, whether there was ever any ownership. It was internet software, which is, where the patents are probably less valuable, but of the failed firms are probably less valuable. A lot of the research we have on salvage value, because it tends to be confidential, the sales details are not really available. We know sort of gross things, which is to say a firm will say, okay, I bought 300 patents from Motorola, and the payment was in the neighborhood of $1 million or $5 million. I have some examples in the backup slides. But they're rather vague, and so the data is collected generally from law firms familiar with the process. In fact, most of the research here is law firms, with the exception of Serrano and Ziodonis. And so the sampling frames are not very well defined. And this is a problem because we have no idea about representativeness. So Love et al. have research based on 100 sales offers of patent lots, 2012 to 2016. Okay. The sellers, 2/3 of the sellers were operating companies, which is really what we're interested in here. The buyers were operating companies and defensive aggregators and patent assertion entities. The patent assertion entities were the vast majority of the asserters in litigation. So subsequently, some of these patents were litigated, and in that case, it wasn't the operating companies that litigated; it was the patent assertion entities, which is what I was saying at the very beginning, which is these patents. Some of these patents that are sold by firms may have value, but their value may be in enforcement, not in technology use. And we have to, ask ourselves, what do we think about that? Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Oliver et al. Again, this is similar data coming from law firms, mostly in the Silicon Valley area. They find 70 to 80% of these sales occurred when the company is underperforming the NASDAQ 100. So what this essentially means is that the sales are happening when the firm is probably failing or coming close to failure. So it is related to our topic. But Serrano and Ziodonis actually used their VC-backed startups. So they already had a sample, Rosemary had a sample of VC-backed startups. And they looked at the failed VC-backed startups. So this is a more detailed investigation. And what they found was that 68% of the patents held by these firms were sold in 5 years. This is a much higher rate than what we had thought previously. Mostly to operating companies. Now, this suggests there is salvage value. I mean, certainly for a number of firms, and that it was sold to operating companies rather than to patent assertion entities, which is to say, I should have defined a patent assertion entity. A patent assertion entity, in my terminology here, people different for this, but I think that specializes in enforcing patents, which is to say, I don't think of it as including universities which are again non-producers, but I mean there are firms that own patents in order to license them to other firms. That's fine, but a patent assertion entity is a firm that primarily owns them in order to litigate against other firms after first offering them a license. It's not, it's in principle, it's a strategy which works in many cases because there may be legitimate reasons why the other firm should take a license, but it's also the case that, especially if it's a widely used technology or related to a widely used technology, that no individual person approached for a license has the incentive to try to countersue or invalidate the patent because of the free rider problem. Because essentially they bear all the cost of doing that, and a number of other entities benefit from that. That's the reason for defensive aggregators. In a way, it's a way of aggregating patents together as a pool, so that if you're approached by a patent assertion entity, you've essentially got not just you, but many other firms involved in the defense. And that is that is a strategy that's been used by people, especially in the information technology sector, the defensive aggregation strategy. So another way that patents value is realized is these patent auctions like Ocean Tomo, which is the most successful. Now, this is a very strange history in some ways. It's very difficult to figure it out from the web, I can tell you. So there's some studies of, when Ocean Tomo started off, it was just a pure auction. Many of them pools of patents. And the data was more or less publicly available. And there have been a number of studies of auctions conducted in the 2000s, which find the value per patent is typically $50K to $150K US dollars per patent. So some of the lots were worth a lot more than that, obviously. They had many patents in them, which is not, it's slightly below what you find typically in the R&D. If you ask, okay, how many patents do you get per R&D? This is slightly lower than the amount. Now we're getting a bunch of noise.
Please, if there is anybody else with the open mic, please just close it. I am listening to some music, actually.
Okay, well, I'll keep going. Maybe they can figure out the mute button. I think maybe they found it. Okay, so Ocean Tomo created a patent value index of firms. So they had a set of firms with a lot of patents in this value index. When they revised it every year. They created it in 2006, and it was used as the basis for some exchange traded funds, which is to say, you could buy a fund which invested in a portfolio of firms that were viewed as having high patent value. If you look online, the last mention of in the Ocean Tomo's website, the last mention of this index is 2014, 2015. It's disappeared from Yahoo Finance, etc. It was traded on the American Stock Exchange, which Amex, I guess, was bought by one of the NASDAQ or whoever. Malcolm Pruitt actually used this index to see if it was valuable, and they found positive excess returns from this index over 2008 to 2013. But in spite of that, okay, which is to say, this tells you that maybe it was a good index to be following, although it's always, things change over time, but still, this does suggest that the patent value index was growing relative to the expectations of the market. It nevertheless, it appears not to have attracted interest, and it's defunct. They had patent applications. When I say some patent applications, I mean Ocean Tomo had patent applications, many of which have been abandoned, and some have been used as security. Now, I think what happened was that Ocean Tomo went through a restructuring. Some of the business got sold to ICAP. However, at this point, both Ocean Tomo came back, and they're no longer held by ICAP. They both seem to be in the patent valuation auction business at this point. But the index has disappeared. Oh, we're still getting noise. I'm just looking to see where it's coming from. Like, well,
yeah, I'm not seeing anybody with the open mic. It's weird.
Yeah. Now it's quiet. Well, I see I see the host and I see you, and I see me, and I see the interpreter. Yeah, but the Zabala Miller, maybe that was it. That might have been it, because they didn't. Whoops, that didn't work. Okay, my screen squaring, my screen sharing is messed up. All right, from current slide. Okay. So here's this paper is not full of strong conclusions, I have to say. The interim conclusion is that the market for patented technologies does exist, but it's not fully developed. The evidence is very incomplete due to lack of transparency in licensing and other anything involving money. So the specifics on firms and prices, definitely difficult to obtain. There are probably differences between sales by a firm exiting a line of business, which may still be valuable, of which a lot of those sales have taken place. Particularly, I mean, we're familiar with the large sales that have taken place in the internet and telecoms sectors. Sales by failed startups whose technology may not be that valuable. So we have more evidence on the former than on the latter, and there is a question whether, for startups, generalizing the general sales by firms exiting a line of business to failed startups strikes me as a little dangerous, because some startups may have technology that, the reason they failed is because the technology is not that valuable. Okay, so we might expect that the value would be a lot less for failed startups. So it'd be nice to have more evidence. And then we ask ourselves, okay, do these markets allocate patented technology to its most productive use? I mean, do they really function that well, or do they essentially just move patents around on technologies which already either exist or are not productive technologies, to places where they can be used in either defense or offense for litigation? Obviously, some litigation is necessary. Otherwise, the patents in general are not enforceable. But there's clearly a nuisance litigation out there, and there's a question about whether that is the most productive use of patents. It may be privately profitable. It may be privately the most profitable, but it may not be the most socially productive use. So I talk a little about the dark side of the patents market for patents. Patents are acquired for a range of reasons, most of which do not involve actually using the protected technology. So there's a study by Burstein in the law literature looking at problems with the markets. And I mentioned the free riding problem, okay, the presence of some low quality patents. The low quality patents could be invalidated at relatively low cost. And in fact, the PTAB, the patent, which is the US Patent Appeal Board, where you can bring evidence that a patent shouldn't have been granted, which was created back in the early 2000s, has been quite successful at removing some of these patents. But there is a free riding problem, which is to say the costs are borne by the one entity and benefit a number of other entities, which means there'll be less challenge of low quality patents than there should be. There's frequency of parallel invention. Kotropi and Lemley looked at patent suits and found essentially no alleged copying. In other words, what they were trying to show was, and I think quite successfully, was that often when an infringement suit is brought, it's the case that one of the things you could allege in an infringement suit is that so-and-so copied my technology, okay, copied what was in the patent. They take the Katropia and Lemley say the fact that there's very little alleged copying in suits, okay, only alleged infringement, but not alleged copying, suggests that the entity being sued had invented the thing in parallel. Okay, now this is easy to imagine in the case of software and internet patents. Okay, and if there's frequent parallel invention, it's not going to make a market in these technologies very very necessary in the sense that it's easy to invent it yourself. You don't need access to the patent to learn how to do whatever it is. Okay. Then I mentioned the bargaining threat points that allow you to extract more value than the invention. That has to do with that's Lemley and Shapiro's argument, which has to do with the idea that once a firm has used an invention to create an innovation and taken a particular route and sunk a lot of resources into it, it's possible to ask for a greater license fee than is really justified, than would have been justified had they licensed the invention before they did the innovation. In other words, ex ante, the invention was worth something, but it could have been invented around. Ex post, you can't invent around because you've already taken that route and you've sunk other resources into it, and therefore the entity suing you can threaten you with a much higher royalty rate. This is very contentious, this view. But it does, it does seem to pass the sniff test. Finally, the actual returns to inventors are low. So the incentive effects are weak, and this, this is the argument. One of the arguments for the market for patents is that for having a market for patents where you can sell the patent itself, okay, rather than the firm or the innovation or whatever, is that it incentivizes inventors who don't necessarily want to invest in. This is an argument very strong. Independent inventor defense. The argument here, made both by Besson and co-authors and by Colleen Chen, is that in fact, when you go out and look and see how much did inventors earn from an invention where they simply sold the patent and sold the invention, you find that the actual returns as a percentage of the value created are actually quite low. So this argues that the incentive effects are possibly fairly weak. I mentioned this Haber and Werfel paper that essentially says the inventors prefer certainty. One of the reasons why they're accepting low returns is because they prefer the certainty of a low return to the uncertainty of a potentially high return or nothing. So I mean, the inventors may be rational here. On the other hand, it may be that the incentives are low. So I already suggested this market for enforcement idea rather than a market for technology. So 63% of the Ocean Tomo lots sold in that sample that I discussed were purchased by non-practicing entities, i.e. possibly patent assertion entities. By non-practicing, I mean entities that were not producing goods, products. It doesn't have to be goods and services. Love et al. Have this evidence that most of the enforcement litigation is coming from patent assertion entities purchasing for that purpose. Katropia et al. find half of all patent cases filed in 2012 are from non-practicing entities. In ICT, it's 70%. We looked in 2008, my co-author, Rosemary Ziodonis, and I, on litigation in semiconductors. So this is now, to some extent what happened in the past. And what we found two things. One is if you were a large R&D doing firm, you were much more likely to be the target of patent lawsuits, which means, which is essentially a deep pockets firm. And that's what that means, is that you're the target because you have money. The surge in lawsuits, what we also identified was a surge in lawsuits filed by non-rivals, which is to say people who weren't in the semiconductor business, ex-rivals, people who used to be in the semiconductor business, such as Wang, Univac, etc. In other words, people trying to retrieve, this is another form of exit strategy. This is firms trying to retrieve value from their patents as they exit by filing the suits themselves, rather than selling them to someone else who will file the suits. The high-profile patent portfolio acquisitions that we know about mostly involve ICT, especially mobile telephony, and it's mostly sold to practicing firms for defensive purposes, not because they're going to litigate them, but because they want to be defended against litigation. Okay, so again, looking again at this survey of venture capitalists and portfolio companies by Feldman, 1/3 of startups have received patent demands, more in information and communication technology. 2/3 report all or almost all of these demands are coming from patent assertion entities. 58% report a significant impact on their firm, which is to say it's a very distracting activity. 100% of the venture capitalists will not invest in a company with an existing patent demand. So that's a lot of these companies. There's a generally among these VCs, there's and portfolio companies. By portfolio companies, I mean companies that are part of a VC's portfolio. The generally negative view of the rise of patent assertion entities, not surprisingly, from all this. Okay, so the view here is that the VC financing and startups are finding that, at least in the ICT sector, a negative consequence of the sale of or the salvage of patents by patent assertion entities. So there is a problem here, which is to say the market isn't really a market for technology. It's a market for enforcement, which is a different activity, trying to extract value from something where, as we saw before, the independent invention may indeed be what's creating these technologies that are being accused of infringing. Okay. One of the solutions to this that has been suggested by others, in which I have to say I'm somewhat sympathetic to, is the independent invention defense, which is to say, if you can show that you invented it independently of the guy who's suing you, of the inventors of the inventors named on the patent, actually, not the person suing you, then you would be found not to be infringed. It's certainly in some sectors, this would be a big help. This leads me to what is the conclusion to this paper, which is an unanswered question, which is, in other words, I haven't answered the question fully that's in the title of the paper. Do the benefits of patents for entry and the creation of salvage value outweigh the transactions costs associated with the assertion of patents by exiting firms and by patent aggregators? Okay, and I produce not an answer, but I produce a quote that I really like from Haber and Werfel in 2016, because I think it gets to the nub of why we have trouble in this area. Some studies claim that PAEs extract rents via nuisance lawsuits, thereby placing a direct tax on innovation. An alternative hypothesis is that PAEs are financial intermediaries that facilitate innovation by extracting value from patents. These hypotheses are not mutually exclusive. And I think that, there's a certain amount of truth in that. I lean towards the first. Haber and Werfel lean toward the second. But I think they're right on that, that there's situations where it's good that inventors can find somebody else to enforce their patents and extract value from them. On the other hand, given the fuzzy boundaries and the weakness of many patents, which is to say the fact that they shouldn't have been issued in the first place, it's also true that there's a prospecting, it's like gold prospecting. There's this prospecting activity of trying to extract value where it's not adding to our to the social value of innovation in any way, and it is in fact taxing innovation. So that's where I want to stop. Let me just tell you, the backup slides are essentially, which people may find interesting. These slides are by and large on my website, so I mean they are obtainable. Is essentially a summary of these large aggregate purchases and some discussion of the mass patent aggregators, which is at this point a little bit dated, and a discussion of why why intellectual ventures and other such firms are successful. So that's all I want to say, and we can have questions.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Hall, for such an interesting and enlightening presentation on especially the role of patenting in this case and ideas, as we saw some slides before. Let me check. I have one of a question from Carmen Contreras.
Let me get my. I'm still screen sharing, and I sort of screwed up the. At least I think I'm screen sharing. I haven't.
Yes, we can see your file.
Yeah. Okay. So I've somehow managed to shrink my display here, and I'm trying to blow it up again. Oh, hey, Pierre! I see Pierre. Hi, Pierre.
Yeah, Pierre is around, and I'm gonna give him the mic if he wants to add an extra question at the end. I have one question written here. I'm gonna read it from my second screen. With respect to patent strategies, it could be that these strategies are different for startups in emerging economies versus industrialized countries. Maybe the cost of patenting is higher for firms in emerging economies if they want to patent in other relevant global markets. And is there any evidence of this, maybe from India or China?
The cost of patenting is higher? Is that what you said?
Yeah, I mean, my understanding is since you're a firm in an emerging economy, but if you want to protect your innovation, you want to patent it in the US or in Europe, and in relative terms.
I think it depends. It depends very much on where you want to exploit your innovation. Okay, the thing to remember, and I say this, I mean, I often say this about the least developed countries, okay, which do not include India and Colombia and so forth. There's essentially no competition coming from the US or Europe or Japan or China. And for those countries, remember that patents are local, right? So for those countries, patenting is just not look like a very attractive activity if you want to produce in that country, because you're not threatened by anybody. The biggest problem is if you're a country like India or Colombia or whatever that wants to ultimately sell worldwide, then you have the problem that you need to patent early because otherwise it's in whatever you've done is in the prior art, right? You essentially only have a year and a half to file for a patent. So you have two threats. One is you need to file early, and the second one is that if you don't file early, somebody else may file, because first to file is the priority rule in all the major patent offices. And that is a problem. That the Patent Cooperation Treaty is meant to be an assistance in that situation, which is to say it's meant to allow you to file once, and it still will cost you to validate in most, to validate or be examined in most major markets, but at least you have a single, application. But I mean, the realities are, and this is one of the reasons why I'm not a big fan of very extravagant intellectual property strategies or systems, is that entry costs are raised if you come from a developing country. I mean, there's no question about it. It's a real problem. It's okay if you want to produce locally, of course, because there's no incentive. There's typically, except for pharmaceuticals. Okay, pharmaceuticals are very much an exception. Pharmaceutical producers do patent in developing countries, and they do patent in middle-income countries, but they are the most active. Almost no one else does in any serious way, unless there's a locally competitive industry. So in Chile, that means mining. Okay, in other places it means something else. But it's definitely the case that for pharmaceuticals, no matter what, they're going to file for patents in every jurisdiction that they can. If the product the patent is associated with is a valuable product, they won't file all the secondary patents necessarily, but they will certainly file the primary patent. I don't know. I don't have more to say about that because I don't have I don't really have a solution. I think one size fits all is a bad idea, basically.
I have a question on my own, if I may. To what extent patents are, saving money to venture capitalists in the sense of investing less in due diligence and more into the signaling effect that the patent have, and or that also depends on the industry in that sense. I mean, a venture capital doing pharmaceuticals can use the patenting, but as you said, that not in the digital industry, for instance.
Mm-hmm. That's a oops, I haven't figured out how to blow this up. I'm still trying to find my full screen version of this. Okay, stop share. There we go. I got it. Yes, I mean, it's right. And that's the whole. If you reduce the cost to the venture capitalist, he may indeed fund more. He has lower costs. He may fund more firms. She may fund more firms. I mean, I don't see it. The question is there a downside to that? Well, I think what you're thinking about is complementary due diligence, not due diligence with respect to the quality of the patent, but other due diligences that might have been useful. I don't know about that. I'd have to know. I sort of doubt it. Okay. I mean, I think the main thing is that it's certifying the idea. It is certainly true that anecdotally, the people here tell me that the first question a VC asks is, "Have you filed for a patent?" Okay. I mean, that's sort of the anecdotal evidence. Yeah. Which means they must think it's important, or they think it's a good signal.
And in a more, say, speculative terms, if I understood correctly, there is some, let's say, market failures in the market of patents, especially since these patent trolls are increasing in terms of importance in the industry. And I understanding also that could have an impact on firms from developing or middle-income countries. So there should be a space for public policy on the emerging country to, let's say, subsidize the firm that want to compete globally because at the global or at the high income countries there is this distortion in the market of patents?
First of all, there are subsidies. Okay, they do exist. China is notorious on this. Okay, they essentially subsidize patent applications by their domestic firms, right? And what do we see? We see an enormous growth in patent applications coming from Chinese entities. And that's essentially, it's essentially doing something which is technically, if you did it via the patent system, would not be allowed because it's non-national, it's not national treatment. Okay, so one of the principles of the Paris Convention was national treatment, which meant essentially that anybody could come to the patent office from worldwide, and to the US Patent Office or the European Patent Office. It didn't matter where they came from. Now, there's a little bit of evidence that examination might matter, which is you expect, but, and also there's a whole issues about whether prior art includes the rest of the world effectively. I mean, it's supposed to, but it may not, and so forth. But you can get around that easily if you run a policy where you subsidize directly your domestic firms' fees. You charge the same fee to everybody, but you subsidize the domestic firms when they apply. So that's, certainly, but that's, again, that's costly for governments, and it's not clear it's the most important thing they should be doing. I mean, probably the most important thing they should be doing is working on the education system. But, I mean, for this purpose, I mean, for innovation purposes, yeah. I mean, I don't really, I don't know whether, China did it partly. China's a big country, and they can't afford things like that. I don't have a clear picture of how much it would cost or how much effect it would have. A lot of this has to do with educating startups. I mean, for example, in Latin America, you have pretty good, in the larger countries, you have intellectual property offices that are capable of doing a certain amount of education. So one, serving an advisory function, right? In addition to granting patents, but actually serving an advisory function for firms. Because I think startups in technology sectors now, even in middle income countries, are pretty aware of this issue. I mean, it's not, of what should they do, So there is a role for an intellectual property office to be partly. This is what happened in Europe, okay, or what is happening in Europe. Because of the European Patent Office, many of the individual patenting offices, IP offices and it's not just patenting, by the way, it's also trademark harmonization and so forth. Many of them lose some of their patent examination functions because they don't get as many applications because of the European Patent Office. And but some of them shifted to an advisory function, advising firms on IP strategy domestically.
If there is no more questions, I'm just gonna. Oh, Dr. Mona is there.
Hi, Pierre.
Just want to say hello, Bronwyn.
I missed all you guys.
It's amazing the number of things that you know. So it was quite interesting, your presentation. There is just one thing I wanted to say is that patents, though, as Mascus has shown, can be useful in a social benefit, in a sense that it helps firms in developed countries to do FDI in developing countries. Right? He has shown that, right?
Who? So sorry.
That's one thing, one good thing about patents.
I'm sorry, I missed who it was who showed this.
Mascus?
Oh, Mascus, Keith. Yeah. I'm sorry, he's not the only one. I mean, there's Brent Setter's done some work on this too. yes, the evidence on the FDI is that middle income countries, not least developed. It doesn't do much for Tanzania, but it helps. In principle, it helps technology transfer. Although I saw one study of Costa Rica where it didn't work very well. Intel established a plant down there, but there was very little spillover to the domestic technology. And that was probably because Costa Rica wasn't well positioned to benefit from spillovers. So anyway, you were asking a question.
No, it was just a remark. I don't know much about patents, but it seemed to me this is a positive value of patents.
Yeah. In principle, it has. The question is whether from the point of view of an innovation economist, the question is whether the FDI also generates some domestic spillovers. So I have a whole survey on this, actually, Pierre. I think I have a talk on this, as I recall. Because when we studied the Chilean case, Chile reformed its patent system roughly at the same time that they exited dictatorship, and following on, they reformed it, and one of the things you see is an increase in domestic patenting, but it's very small and it's rather late. It takes a long time, 10 years, 15 years. But it did have an incentive effect. There's plenty of FDI in Chile also, I believe. Well, not plenty, but there's some. And they've been receptive to it. But Pierre is right that not just Keith Maskus, but other economists have also shown that that for a middle income country, existence of the patent system is important for FDI. And the reason is that there's a general view that a middle income country, in many cases, is capable of imitation. And therefore, the patent system protects the technology when it's brought into the country. For the least developed countries, this is not true. The patents don't make much difference.
Well, thank you so much. I know, organizers, that I took way longer than I thought, but I was enjoying the presentation and the discussion at the end. So thank you so much again, Dr. Hall, Dr. Monen, and Laura. I give you the floor.
Okay, thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, doctor Vargas. Muchas gracias a la profesora Hall. Y con esta presentación damos por finalizada la agenda del día 1 en la cuarta conferencia de la Red de Economía de la Innovación y el Emprendimiento de América Latina y el Caribe, RIE. No olviden, por favor, que mañana iniciaremos a las 10:15 con la sesión contributiva y que esta no tendrá traducción simultánea. Una vez finalizada la sesión, podrán conectarse a la sala principal, que es esta, y el link lo encuentran en la agenda oficial del evento. 10:15, sala contributiva, y enseguida continuaremos en la sala principal. Muchas gracias a todos por acompañarnos y que tengan un feliz día.
Muchas gracias a todos. Entonces, nos vemos mañana.